Today's episode is brought to you by Land of Empires. History has shown us that almost all cultures have believed in some form of afterlife, and that in many practices, where those of a pure heart would go to heaven, the opposite would find themselves in some form of hell. The Greeks had Hades, a place of suffering and torment that was carved out not just for the humans, but also the gods themselves. Mainstream Christianity and modern religious beliefs see the sinner or the wrongdoer head for a simpler hell that's commonly illustrated as fiery and desolate. These underworlds, those that were inaccessible by the living, usually had a governor that ruled these terrible regions, whether this be Hades himself in Greek mythology or the more recognized Satan in Christian beliefs. Unsurprisingly, the notion of an underworld and its menacing ruler sprung from the civilizations of Mesopotamia, where such a concept of the underworld first appeared. To the Sumerians, it was known as Ker, or Knigia, or Ereshkigal by the Akkadians, and it was ruled by a goddess, or the Queen of the Great Below, she who was Ereshkigal, arguably one of the most feared deities in the entire pantheon. Before we get started with today's episode, a brief message from the sponsor of today's video, Land of Empires. Land of Empires is an online MMO strategy mobile game where players must fight in an epic war between mythical heroes and demons. Collect resources, recruit heroes, and train your troops to do battle against the demon horde as you fight for the ultimate supremacy over the Glory continent. Step into a medieval fantasy world where menacing dark forces have gathered and take part in real-time PvE battles as you search the lost land for resources, relics, and new equipment. As you bolster your army with new tools and weapons, you can recruit legendary figures from history, from Cleopatra, Heracles, and El Cid, to name a few. Even creatures like the Titans can be tamed and used in your strategy to defeat the evil demons. One thing that stood out to me whilst playing Land of Empires is the great art style used throughout the game, providing players with great cinematic scenes and gorgeous environments to play through. Land of Empires is available worldwide on Google Play and the App Store. If you'd like to give it a try, I recommend you use my code LEGENDSLOE to get a $10 in-game reward. Just head on over to landofempires.com/cdkey, sign in with your account, and enter the code to redeem the offer. And now back to Ereshkigal. As we've established thus far in this Mesopotamian series, Ereshkigal was not some elusive deity who stuck to the shadows. As an underworld deity, it's tempting to believe that there would be some mystery surrounding such a goddess, who had something of a pivotal role in the life and death cycle. But to the Mesopotamians, Ereshkigal was a most revered deity, and a deity who was as well known as the likes of Anu, Enki, Enlil, and of course her sister Inanna. Known to the locals as the Queen of the Great Below, or the Lady of the Great Place, Ereshkigal's existence was certainly not something that was overlooked. In fact, quite the contrary. She was a fearful goddess who occupied a space that no man would ever wish to find himself, a place where he was judged for his malfeasances and subsequently torn apart by the goddess's demons. It was here where she governed, both as a judge of those who were sent to her and secondarily as their warden. To the dead though, she wasn't just the goddess of the underworld, she was the only goddess, for seldom did anyone, not even the gods, wish to tread upon her realm. Indeed, one of her responsibilities was to maintain the separation between the living realm and the dead one, where she denied the living from entering and visiting those who had passed. Why she did this? Well, you might say she was simply mean-spirited, but perhaps more logically, it was to prevent the living from learning too much about what happens after death, and to prevent them from preparing for such an inevitability. The Sumerians knew Ereshkigal's underworld as Ker, or Knigia, while the Akkadians knew the realm as Ereshkigal. It was believed to be a realm that sat beneath the mountains in the west, and was otherwise dubbed as a land that one could not come back from, given the nature of dying. It reinforced the concept that death was absolute, and that whilst there was an afterlife, one could not return from the physical world they had once known, once they had died. It was here in Kur, the Underworld, that souls were forced to drink from puddles of mud and consume dust as part of their daily diet. It is not specified in text, but this may have given rise to the idea that nourishment was still something that the soul required, and whilst it had no access to the physical world in order to enjoy crops, bread, fruit, water, or wine, it did have access to the more grim offerings of the underworld, mud and dust. The underworld, as described in the poem The Descent of Inanna, is also believed to have 7 daunting gates that a soul must pass through on its way to Ereshkigal. With this idea, Ereshkigal's realm was immediately a place that one would not want to spend too much time, or perhaps would prefer to avoid altogether. Her realm was vastly different from the Garden of the Gods, the Sumerian heaven, if you will, which was illustrated as a wondrous garden full of plants and trees and fruits. The gods were also present in their garden and seemed to be having a joyous time with feasts and adventures. Ereshkigal, on the other hand, was mostly alone, if not for her servant Neti. The two holed up in what could only be described as a spiritual prison that was home to the damned. Despite her isolation, Ereshkigal was able to form relationships with the other gods, or at least maintain the few that she had, for better or worse. Her younger sister Inanna is usually the first to spring to mind, and given that the two were arguably the most powerful goddesses in the pantheon, it is only natural that their relationship was troubled and strained. Meanwhile, her first husband was the great bull Gorgolana, he who she also fathered the god Ninanzu with. Unfortunately for Gorgolana though, he was slain by the hero Enkidu. Her second husband was Enlil of the Mesopotamian Holy Trinity, and it was with him that she bore the son Namtar. Finally, the god of destruction Nergal also found his way into Ereshkigal's lonely bed, and appears to have been the only deity who could put up with her and her realm, choosing to remain with her for 6 months of every year as co-ruler of the Underworld. But more on those individual stories later. One of the most interesting things about Ereshkigal, aside from her jurisdiction over the Underworld, was her influence and popularity. She was widely recognised as the Queen of the Dead, and while she was feared because of this, she was also greatly respected. Now some of you may be thinking that if this was the case, then surely there'd be more illustrations or statues of her. And whilst that may be true in some respects, there may be a reasonable explanation. You see, the Mesopotamians often believed that there was power in images, and that if one was to depict or construct an image of a god, they were ultimately inviting that presence into their household or into their lives. This was all well and good if the people were trying to invite the likes of Enlil, Enki, Nabu, or Dumazid in the hopes of attracting protection, healing, wisdom, or fertile land. But to invoke Ereshkigal was to essentially court death. So depicting Ereshkigal was typically discouraged and naturally seen as a bad omen. On the subject, you may have heard of the Berni relief, a terracotta plaque believed to have originated from the year 2000 before the Common Era. Some scholars have deduced that this is a depiction of Inanna, or the demon Lilith, but to some, this is believed to have been Ereshkigal, perhaps made by some thrill-seekers or daredevils who wanted to either pay homage to the goddess of the dead or to invoke her. One of the most significant things you might have picked up from the concept of the Mesopotamian underworld is that it was indeed governed by a woman, showing us that in the ancient world, one of the most powerful beings that everyone was scared of was actually female. This is also true after the reign of various Mesopotamian kings, who began to favour the male gods over the female ones. During this time, many of the goddesses lost their status in favour of their male counterparts, but it would appear Ereshkigal remained powerful, and despite coming to share her rule with her husband Nergal, was not ultimately usurped by him. You might say that this only emphasised the power of Ereshkigal, that her role as the goddess of the underworld could not be determined by the kings, nor could it be taken away by them. Ultimately, this is fitting, given that Ereshkigal prevented man from entering the underworld before their time had come, and so therefore, by the same logic, it could be reconciled that she denied the kings from having any real consequence over her or her realm. Ereshkigal makes her most significant appearance in the Descent of Inanna, where we see Inanna choosing to travel to the Underworld to attend the funeral of Ereshkigal's husband Gulgulana. Now, some of you know that his death can be seen as Inanna's fault, given that it was she who had recruited Gulgulana to destroy Gilgamesh, after having been rejected by him. However, instead, it is Gilgamesh's friend Enkidu who ends up killing Gulgulana to prevent him from destroying Gilgamesh and others around him. Naturally, there is a part of Ereshkigal that blames Inanna for her husband's death, and so when she learns that Inanna has come to her realm to attend his funeral, she is not pleased at all. She instructs her servant Neti to gradually strip Inanna at the first of the 7 gates that led to her throne room, and as Inanna passes through each gate, she is removed of an item of clothing. By the time she reaches her sister after the final gate, she stands before her naked and vulnerable. At this stage, we see Ereshkigal and the Anunnaki, those who decree the fates of the humans in the underworld, cast judgment upon Inanna. With this judgment, Ereshkigal executes her sister and displays her corpse as a decoration, and perhaps as a warning to others that if she is able to mercilessly slay her sister, imagine what she might do to a stranger. But this was not the end of Inanna, for the goddess was as wily as she was seductive. Before descending to Ereshkigal's realm, Inanna had instructed her servant Ninsheba to appeal to the gods, that if anything was to happen to her, then she would be resurrected. Indeed, a bargain is struck, and Inanna is resurrected, which sees her freed from her sister's desolate realm. However, Ereshkigal does not let this matter go so simply. Instead, she brings up from the underworld a horde of demons, and threatens the gods that if Inanna is not returned, or if a soul is not given in exchange for her life, then she will open the gates of her realm, and let the demons have their way with the earth. The gods, seemingly incapable of calling Ereshkigal's bluff, are quick to try and find a solution, none the least asking Inanna to head back to Carnigia and live out her sentence. But Inanna refuses, and instead begins to look for a substitute. In the end, she ends up sacrificing her husband Dumuzid, who she found partying and fornicating with other women, instead of mourning her. Content with this substitute, Ereshkigal accepts Dumuzid's soul as an alternative, and plunges him into the underworld, showing us that not only did Ereshkigal get her way, but that there was also no way to really cheat death. Indeed, you might say that Inanna certainly did so, by offering up her husband's life in order to save her own. But as we later see in the poem known as the Return of Dumuzid, Inanna begins to mourn for her husband, and perhaps experiences the same pain that her sister did at having lost hers. With this, she comes to a compromise with Ereshkigal, in which Dumuzid can return to live with her for 6 months of the year, and in his place will go his sister Geshtinana. The act of this shows us that at least for the gods, their deaths are only an absolute if they cannot find a replacement to serve their sentence. As we see here, Geshtinana selflessly submits herself for 6 months of the year so that Dumuzid can be with Inanna. However, when it comes to humans, such a luxury is not offered. At least, no one in the Mesopotamian world claimed to have used it. When a human died, they died for good, and so it becomes evident that this trading of places was a privilege exclusive to the gods alone. The fact that Ereshkigal allows for this loophole to be established is quite telling of some more compassionate characteristics that she is not known for. For one, she could have easily denied Inanna of having her husband at all, and kept him from her out of spite for having gotten her husband Gulgulana killed. Instead, she agrees to the terms and allows Inanna to be in love again, at least for 6 months of the year, which I suppose is more than most people get, and certainly more than Inanna had the right to ask for. You might also say that Ereshkigal had simply gotten over what Inanna had done to her husband, for though she had gotten him killed, he would have ended up in the underworld with her anyway. What's more, it's often debated as to who the hero of this particular story is, and while some might say it is Inanna, likely on the account that she does suffer and go through some struggles of her own, she can also be seen as the villain too. Notice Inanna is judged for her crimes and deemed as being in the wrong. With this sentencing, Ereshkigal has every right to execute her, as per the customs of her domain. But I'm sure we can all agree that it was natural for Ereshkigal to also seek revenge for the death of her husband. Inanna was probably also aware of her guilt too, which is why she instructs Ninshurba to get the gods to bring her back to life before she makes her descent. It's also interesting that when bringing Inanna back to life, none of the gods, not even Enki, dare to set foot into the underworld. Instead, Enki is seen to send 2 demonic flies to attack Ereshkigal in an effort to get her to relinquish Inanna's body. It is these demonic flies, known as the Gala, who are able to subdue Ereshkigal in some fashion, but even they are sympathetic towards her and release her from their binding, which is where Ereshkigal responds in gratitude and allows the flies to take Inanna's body. Furthermore, despite Enki's attempt to pinch Inanna from the underworld, Ereshkigal does not let the matter go, and promises dire consequences if Inanna's soul is not replaced with another. Despite the accumulated strength of all the gods, none appear to argue with her reasoning, and instead work to find a compromise. But is Ereshkigal denied her justice? After all, by the end of the story, it is not Inanna who directly suffers, for Dumuzid and Geshtinanna appear to foot the bill. Inanna meanwhile appears to go scot-free. There are many interpretations to this story, such as revenge, consequences, impermanence, and even mortality, but a common one is justice. Ereshkigal attempts to bring Inanna to justice for the crimes committed against her late husband, whilst Inanna attempts to evade justice by getting Enki to bail her out and condemning Dumuzid and Geshtinanna to resume her sentence. What one might gather from such a story is that justice isn't always served, and that even the gods themselves, one such as Ereshkigal no less, can be scorned by its inability to ensure the right outcome. Put simply, and rather bleakly, sometimes closure isn't always established, and even if someone does deserve to suffer for a previous crime, they might actually end up getting away with it, or at least serving a lighter sentence than they ought to. As we've seen with the gods so far, most appear to be either in reverence of Ereshkigal, or arguably in fear of her, much as the everyday person might have been. But one god who may have been too bullheaded to even realise her power was Nergal, the god of destruction, a god who saw no merit in acquiescing to Ereshkigal, much less show her any respect. In the story titled Ereshkigal and Nergal, we see the gods sitting down to enjoy a great feast. Unfortunately, Ereshkigal could not attend, on the account that she could not leave the underworld, and so, in her stead, she sent her son, Namtar. When Namtar arrived, everyone stood up in respect of Ereshkigal, but Nergal remained seated. Insulted by his lack of respect, Namtar returned to his mother and told her of how Nergal had slighted them both with his decision to remain seated. Upon hearing this, Ereshkigal demanded that Nergal be sent to her so that she may punish him for his indiscretion, and that form of punishment was of course execution. This put the gods in a tricky spot, because whilst they didn't want to deny Ereshkigal for fear of her wrath, they were equally conscious of Nergal's temper and how setting him off could result in massive destruction. So it is of course Enki who must use his wily ways to defuse the situation. He provides Nergal with 14 demons and tells him to visit Ereshkigal, and whilst the entourage of demons was welcomed by Nergal, it wasn't clear what their purpose was, nor why he was even being sent to Ereshkigal at all. But in any case, he agreed to go, likely unconcerned by Ereshkigal's power, and more than willing to duke it out, if necessary. As he made his way through the 7 gates, as Inanna had done in her descent, Ereshkigal ordered the gates to close behind him, in an effort to trap him here in the underworld. Unbeknownst to her though, the demons, now under the influence of Nergal, were instructed to hold the gates open for him, so that he might make his way back. Upon reaching the throne room, the 2 deities do battle, but it is Nergal who proves to be triumphant as he defeats both Ereshkigal and her son Namtar. Lifting his axe to decapitate Ereshkigal, she begs for her life and promises him that if he spares her life, she will share her powers with him. Struck by the promise of even more power as co-ruler of the Underworld, Nergal agrees, and the two end up marrying. Now it might be said that this whole fiasco was orchestrated by the trickster Enki as a means to get Nergal out of the way. Nergal, as we know, was always destroying things on Earth, or losing his temper and starting wars. In an effort to maintain a more peaceful world, some believe that Enki had relied upon Nergal showing disrespect to Namtar, and that this would result in him being summoned to the Underworld to pay with his life. Of course, with this understanding, it might be said that Enki sends demons with Nergal so that he might have been more reassured in his descent, and made him more likely to go at all. Enki though appears to have underestimated Nergal here, for we see Nergal instruct the demons to hold the gates open for him, showing us that this god wasn't more brawn than brains after all. After having defeated Ereshkigal, she has no choice but to bargain for her life, something that we'd never see her do in any other mythological tales. This is the first and only time in Mesopotamian mythology that a patriarchy is established in the Underworld, one that evidently overshadowed Ereshkigal in that moment. But because of the humans' need for war and destruction, Nergal could not remain in the Underworld forever, and was often believed to have returned to the physical world through the gates that were now held open for him. With this, Nergal became the only deity and being who could willingly come and go from the Underworld as he pleased. A direct correlation between Ereshkigal and the Underworld gods of later years has never been identified, but perhaps that isn't necessary, given what we know of Underworld deities. To the Egyptians, for example, the Underworld ruler Osiris was bound to this realm, otherwise known as the Duat. Like Ereshkigal, he too did not visit the land of the living, and was considered bound to the confines of his realm. In Norse mythology, meanwhile, the Underworld deity was believed to have been Hel, who ruled over the dreaded land, and like Ereshkigal, was a woman. But perhaps the most similar tale we have that appears to have been inspired by Ereshkigal was that of Hades and Persephone in Greek mythology. This tale, like the tale of Inanna's descent and Dumuzid's return, also sees beings trapped in the Underworld, where their return to the physical world becomes conditional. Like with Dumuzid, Persephone must remain with Hades for 6 months of the year, and whilst Hades' motives might differ from Ereshkigal's, both are unmoved by the pleas or requests of loved ones. Ereshkigal was certainly seen as a potent goddess, one who was tremendously powerful and almost untethered by the other virtues of the gods. Indeed, she encouraged moralistic and righteous behaviour, but she did this through warning and consequence. Where the other gods recommended peace and goodness, Ereshkigal showed the people what would happen to those who did not live good and wholesome lives. Perhaps more importantly, Ereshkigal kept the realms of the living and the dead separated, protecting those who were still alive and guarding those who had already perished. It is with these notions that suggest why she was so renowned in her time, for not only were the people grateful for her sacrifice in relegating herself to the Underworld, but they were also given more incentive to act in the best interests of others, so as to avoid having their soul being damned to her level. Indeed, the Mesopotamians may have greatly revered Ereshkigal, but you can bet that very few were actually that keen on meeting her. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode on Mesopotamian Mythology Explained, then don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.